This is section 3. I think it was mislabeled on the last slides you watched, but this is all the evidences that evolution is occurring. So we're going to start with the first one, which is fossil evidence. Basically what fossils are showing us is that species have been changing over time. So we can also find extinct species in the fossil record, and sometimes fossils will even preserve the environmental conditions that existed at the time that the organism died. So there's two ways that we can actually date a fossil. First one's called relative dating. This is when we just basically look at the rock layers, and whichever layer is higher, we know that it's a newer organism or that it died, sooner than the one that's lying below it. So we can't get an absolute date from this. We're simply just kind of putting them in order of which one's older and younger. A better way to do this would be something called absolute dating. This is when we can actually get very, very close to exactly how long ago an organism lived. We do it using carbon-14 dating, which is how quickly the radioactive isotope in that carbon breaks down. So carbon-14 is an isotope of regular carbon, and all organic living life forms have carbon in them. So we kind of use that radioactive decay to get really close to right around how old an organism really is. So this picture is showing just relative dating. This is the one that's a little bit less precise, and it's just kind of showing how it works. As sediments maybe get carried by a river down into the ocean floor, over time we just kind of lay deposit on top of deposit. And this is showing like maybe where a sea once was, and as it kind of fills up with sediments, it becomes a solid landmass, which is why oftentimes we'll find sea creatures preserved in areas where there isn't even water anymore. But back in the day, there might have been. So just kind of showing, again, the older fossils are going to be way at the bottom. The newest ones are going to be way at the top. And then this picture is showing absolute dating. This is a series of human skulls, kind of from our ancestors to present day skull here down at the end. And this would be very hard to put these in order, to know which one came first and last, simply because, again, in the rock layers where they're found down at relatively the same depths as one another. So this is where we'd have to do some carbon-14 dating. We'd have to actually put them in order based on exact age. So we use that radioactive isotope to put these in the correct timeline, and you can kind of watch the skull progression here. So for the jaw bones, as time has gone on, the head has gotten kind of a little bit more rounder in the back, and the jaw has gotten smaller, and the eye sockets have gotten a little bit bigger. So just some different things you see changing over time. So what is the fossil evidence proving? Basically that species are changing over time. We can actually see that slow progression. Oftentimes we'll see that they share a common ancestor. So we'll see several species that look alike, and in the fossil record we'll often see even a branching of that common ancestor. And then again, like I said, sometimes we can even trap environmental conditions. So like down in the Antarctic ice layers, they can literally, when they pull out chunks of the ice, there's carbon trapped in there, there's oxygen levels, so they can monitor the CO2 levels at the time and really kind of see some major world events that were occurring at the time that some of these organisms died. So a good example of this is in your flex book. On page 9, it talks about how horses have evolved over time, and it kind of shows their fossil record. So in a common day, they're much taller, and they used to have like separate toes, which have now formed into the hoof, and those hooves have actually made them much faster and better runners. So if you want to read a little bit more about that, just check your flex book. All right, the second evidence for evolution is called comparative anatomy, and what we're doing here is just looking at the structures of species to identify similarities and differences between them. So what we call a homologous structure is when we get very similar bones in a couple organisms or several organisms, simply then telling us that they probably came from a common ancestor, but over time, as they kind of moved into their particular environments and adapted, we call it divergent evolution. So they're splitting apart from one another, but yet those bones have remained the same. And we'll look at a picture of that here on the next page. And then the opposite of this is the analogous structures. So this is when we have completely unrelated organisms, so they don't share a common ancestor. They kind of came from completely different lineages, but because of where they live, so maybe they all live in the water, they have evolved to kind of look the same and do the same job. So we call that convergent evolution. And this would be like a bat, a bird, and a butterfly. These are, three separate family lines, basically. We have an insect and a mammal and a bird, which is its own little group there. So, but they all kind of look alike. They have the wings and they're able to fly, but definitely not coming from a common ancestor. So here's what homologous structures look like. We have the human, the cat, the whale, and the bat, and they're kind of highlighting each of these bones that are still common in these animals. So the green would be like the humerus, you have the ulna and the radius, and the wrist or carpal bones down there. So obviously a whale doesn't use their appendage the same way that humans and a cat do, but the pieces are all still there. So just again showing us that we probably diverged from a common ancestor. And the same thing with the bat here too. Very different purpose for its arm, but the bones are all still there. And then in analogous structures, very different. The bat has bones, a butterfly does not. The bird has limited cartilage and feathers, so we're definitely not built the same, but they're definitely a wing shape and they look alike simply based on the fact that they need to fly to do their job and to live. All right, the third evidence for evolution is called comparative embryology. And this is when we actually look at the embryos of those beginning stages of life of organisms. So the more closely related two organisms are, the more similar they're going to be as they're developing. So down below here we have two pictures. One is a human and one is a chicken. And you can tell just how close these two look. So, it's pointing out the head. Here you can see the eye. The backbone is present, so you can actually see the whole spine and all the vertebrae. And then there is a tail that is present, and eventually that tail will be separated into two legs for the human and two legs on that chicken. So very close. We literally can't even tell which one's which. But there's also a whole nother link down here, pbs.org. If you want to check that out, type that into your web browser. It'll walk you through a whole bunch of other organisms too, comparing them to humans. So you can see just how close a human and a pig are, or a human and a monkey, and human and a fish. And you can kind of watch just how close we are as we're developing as embryos. The fourth proof that evolution's occurring is called a vestigial structure. And what these are is they once had an important reason for existing, but today there's really no survival advantage. So these are structures that are kind of going away in terms of evolution. So some of the best examples I can give you are on the human body. First one being the appendix on the human. If you don't know what that is, it's a tiny little sac that kind of sits at the beginning of your large intestine. And back in the day, it was an organ that kind of helped us break down some of those more fibrous type grasses and leaves. So breaking down that nice cellulose in the plant walls. But today, there is no real advantage for having an appendix. As far as we know, it's just kind of holds some bacteria that maybe help with digestion. A lot of people get their appendix removed and they're fine. So that's what we consider a vestigial structure. We can live without it. No real survival advantage for having it. Same thing with the human tailbone. Back in the day, those bones were not fused. So today they're 5 fused bones and they've kind of curved under us. And now we kind of sit down on your sacrum and your tailbone. Or excuse me, the sacrum's 5 bones, the tailbone's only 3, but they've fused and they never used to be. So back in the day, it was, we call it a tailbone because it literally was separate bones, and it probably was a tail that we used for balance like a lot of animals currently do today. But as of right now, again, it's just something we kind of sit on, and there's really no advantage for that. Human goosebumps would be another example. We don't need goosebumps anymore, but yet we still get them, and we get them at the same times that we used to get them, when you're scared or when you're cold. And back in the day, when you're cold, it used to trap heat for you, and when you're scared, it made you look more intimidating to your predators, when we were a little bit more hairy creatures. So, and then another good one here is the whale. Whales actually still have pelvic bones. So obviously they don't have legs anymore, but this is just a suggestion that, okay, if the hip bone is still there, we definitely could assume that at one time they probably had some leg bones that were attached to it. They may have then evolved from a land mammal of some sort and kind of made their way into the water. All right, our fifth evidence is looking at the DNA. So again, the more closely related two organisms are, their DNA sequences are going to be very similar. So this is probably our strongest evidence for proving that we do have a common ancestor and that we diverged from one another maybe not too long ago. We call this a molecular clock. So the less differences you have, the less time since you diverged from your common ancestor. So we can see down here we're looking at hemoglobin, which is a protein that carries oxygen in your blood. And we're comparing the human, which is why it's at 0, okay? And we're comparing that to all these other organisms. So between a human and a gorilla, there's only one amino acid difference in our hemoglobin. For a rhesus monkey, there's only 8. Look at the mouse, we're up to 27. A chicken's at 45. And by far, the furthest away from us is the frog. We have 67 differences with just this one protein. So in terms of hemoglobin, you know, the way we carry oxygen in our blood, us and a gorilla are definitely most similar there. The sixth evidence is called biogeography. And what this means is literally we're kind of watching organisms and how they adapt to their different environments. So back in the 70s, scientists went back to the Galapagos Islands where Darwin had studied all the finches. And they watched a bunch of these finches kind of change after a drought had occurred on the islands. So what happened was some of those bigger beaks ended up flourishing because they were able to get at the food a little bit better than some of those smaller beaked finches that really couldn't get into the seeds or break it open. So that drought, you know, just a simple weather pattern is kind of what really drove the amount of food available, and then ultimately whatever beak they had was the final driving force. So this is just showing us that environment does influence change in your gene frequency, specifically your food source, you know, that type of thing. And islands are a place we always kind of look to see just how different things become, because from one island to the next, even though they're maybe only separated by, you know, a couple 100 miles, maybe even less than that, it may be the same animal, but it'll look completely different based on one island and the next just because of their food source and maybe even just their climate changing from one island to the next. So separation geographically, even though, you know, it's the same animal, based on where you live, that really can make a difference on what you look like. And then the seventh evidence is that we can actually see microevolution occurring in common day medicine. This is something that's kind of new, but we're seeing it a lot more. It's called antibiotic resistance. And basically what's happening is when you go to the doctor, you're sick, you're not feeling well, the doctor puts you on a pack of pills. Usually you take them for a week, it's an antibiotic. We just assume that the sickness was being caused by bacteria. And so you take this pack, you kill off all the weak bacteria, but unfortunately sometimes there are some bacteria that survive, and we call them resistant. So over time, this bacteria in your body, as it reproduces then, it is of that resistant type. So it kind of gets stronger and stronger with each reproduction. So the next time you take the pill pack, it may not work as well as it did the first time before. And then by the third and fourth time you're taking that same antibiotic, it's pretty much not working at all. It's not even killing the bacteria. They're all resistant. So a good example of this is something called MRSA. Stands for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. So it's just a type of bacteria which happens to be really common in hospitals, because what's happening is as they disinfect, you know, then wipe down everything after somebody leaves the hospital room, they're only killing, you know, 99% of the bacteria. Well, you've left behind that 1%. They reproduce, they grow, they thrive, and unfortunately, they're very hard to kill off. So a lot of people can get very sick from MRSA. Kind of common for people who maybe have just had a surgery, and then this bacteria tends to get into their little open cuts and infections, and definitely a very hard thing to treat, and it's kind of dangerous. It's been known to kill people, so something we have to watch out for. And this picture is just showing, you know, here's a typical bacteria. Okay, we treat the bacteria with an antibiotic, hoping to kill it all off. There we go. But with drug-resistant bacteria, what happens is, again, there's just a few bacteria in there that lived through that dose of the drug, and so they're left to multiply. And then the next time you give that drug, obviously you're going to have more and more surviving. So it's a simple mutation that just occurred in the bacteria and made it stronger, made it live through that antibiotic. So this is just kind of a cute little cartoon that says, I think I need an antibiotic for my cold. He was going to say cold, and Batman's slapping him and says, it's a virus, because viruses cannot be treated with antibiotics. So doctors are getting smarter. You know, when you go in for a cold, now they'll treat your symptoms. They don't always put you on an antibiotic. They kind of know it's a virus that's probably causing it. So we're getting a little bit better, but it's still something we have to be careful with. So, all right, I think that's it. So that's the end of your notes.